My name is Amara Voss, and this is the story of how my family's greatest betrayal became my most powerful weapon. The courthouse steps felt like ice beneath my feet as I walked toward what I thought would be the formal reading of my father's will. The morning air in Lyon was crisp, cutting through my black dress like the grief that had been consuming me for weeks since Papa's funeral. I clutched my small purse tighter, not because it contained anything valuable, but because it was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. Inside that sterile legal office, I sat between my older brother Matthias and my younger sister Isadora, the three of us arranged like pawns on a chessboard. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, shuffled through papers with the efficiency of someone who had delivered both dreams and devastation countless times before. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of formality that made even breathing feel like an intrusion. "We are here today for the final reading of Claude Voss's last will and testament." My heart hammered against my ribcage. I was not expecting riches. I was not expecting mansions or priceless paintings or Swiss bank accounts overflowing with inherited wealth. All I wanted was acknowledgement. All I craved was proof that I had mattered to the man who had raised me, who had taught me to draw my first architectural sketches on the back of restaurant napkins, who had smiled with pride when I graduated from the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture. What I received instead was a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the oxygen from the room. "The estate," the lawyer continued, his words falling like stones into still water, "will be divided between Matthias Voss and Isadora Voss." The words hung in the air like smoke from a devastating fire. My name was not mentioned. Not once. Not even as a footnote. I felt the blood drain from my face as the terrible reality crashed over me like a tsunami of rejection. My own father had erased me from existence as completely as if I had never been born. The man who had held me as a baby, who had bandaged my scraped knees, who had walked me down the aisle at my brief, failed marriage 7 years ago, had looked at his life's work and decided I deserved nothing. Absolutely nothing. Matthias shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Isadora stared at her manicured hands, as if they held the secrets of the universe. Neither of them would meet my eyes, and their silence spoke louder than any words could have. But it was my mother's reaction that shattered what remained of my composure. Veronique Voss sat at the far end of the conference table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her Chanel suit pressed to perfection. When I turned to her with eyes that surely reflected my devastation, expecting comfort or explanation, or at least acknowledgement of the cruelty of this moment, she simply tightened her lips into a thin line of disapproval. "You were always too independent, Amara," she said finally, her voice carrying both an excuse and a condemnation that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Your father felt that you would be fine on your own." Independent. The word that had shaped my entire identity now became the weapon they used to justify my abandonment. Independent, because I had chosen architecture over the family wine business. Independent, because I had moved to Marseille instead of staying in the family compound in Lyon. Independent, because I had divorced my husband when he cheated rather than tolerating infidelity for the sake of appearances. Independent, because I had dared to dream beyond the narrow confines of what the Voss family deemed acceptable for their daughter. As my siblings discussed their newfound wealth with barely concealed excitement, I sat in that chair feeling as though I was disappearing molecule by molecule. Matthias would inherit the vineyard that had been in our family for 4 generations. Isadora would receive the jewelry collection, the antique furniture, the vacation home in Provence, and a trust fund that would ensure she never had to work another day in her privileged life. And I would receive the knowledge that my own family considered me so worthless that they could not even spare me a single euro or a treasured photograph, or even an explanation. The meeting ended with handshakes and legal formalities that felt like the final shovelfuls of dirt being thrown onto my grave. I walked out of that office and into the bright afternoon sunshine that seemed to mock my darkness. My siblings climbed into their respective luxury cars, probably already planning how to spend their inheritance, while I stood on the sidewalk like a ghost haunting the scene of her own funeral. The train ride back to Marseille felt endless. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and watched the French countryside blur past in streaks of green and gold. Other passengers chatted and laughed and lived their normal lives while I sat in the wreckage of everything I had believed about family and love and belonging. When I finally reached my small one-bedroom apartment in the Pannier district, the familiar scent of lavender and sea salt that usually comforted me felt hollow. I looked around at my modest possessions, my second-hand furniture, my collection of architecture books that I had saved for months to afford, and realized that this was it. This was my inheritance. No vineyard stretching across rolling hills. No jewelry passed down through generations of Voss women. No trust fund to cushion the blows of an uncertain world. But as I stood there in the golden light filtering through my small windows, something shifted inside me like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. No chains either. No expectations to fulfill that were not my own. No family obligations that would force me to compromise my dreams. No legacy to uphold except the one I would create with my own two hands. I walked to my drafting table, still cluttered with the blueprints I had been working on before Papa's death, and spread my hands across the clean white paper that represented infinite possibility. The city of Marseille sprawled below my window. Thousands of people living in apartments and houses that someone had designed, someone had dreamed into existence. If they will not give me a legacy, I whispered to the empty room, I will build one that makes theirs look like a child's sandcastle. The next morning, I threw myself into my work with the fury of someone who had been pushed past every breaking point and discovered she was made of stronger material than anyone had ever imagined. I worked 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, and the burning need to prove that their rejection had been the greatest mistake of their lives. My small apartment became a war room. Every surface covered with sketches and calculations and dreams that grew more ambitious with each passing day. I designed homes for people like me, the overlooked, the underestimated, the unchosen. But I did not design charity housing or sad little boxes that screamed of poverty and shame. I created beautiful, dignified spaces that honored the people who would live in them. Affordable housing with soaring ceilings and natural light and private gardens where children could play safely. Every line I drew was a declaration of war against the idea that worthiness was determined by birthright or bank account or family approval. Every blueprint was a love letter to everyone who had ever been told they did not matter. Finding investors was like walking through hell wearing paper shoes. I knocked on doors until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. I presented my ideas to venture capitalists who looked at me as if I had suggested building houses on the moon. I pitched my projects to government officials who barely looked up from their phones. But slowly, painfully, magnificently, I began to build something that had never existed before. A woman named Celeste Moreau, who ran a foundation for displaced families, became my first real supporter. She looked at my designs for transitional housing and saw not just buildings but hope made manifest in brick and steel and glass. This is not just architecture, she said, her eyes bright with tears as she studied my plans. This is revolution. With her backing, I secured my first contract. A housing development for single mothers in the outskirts of Marseille. 24 units, each with its own entrance and small yard, designed to foster both privacy and community. I remember the day we broke ground. I stood in the red dirt wearing a hard hat and work boots, holding a shovel that felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. The photographers captured the moment, but they could not capture the way my heart felt, as though it might explode from the sheer magnitude of what was beginning. This was my inheritance, claimed not from a will, but from my own will to create something meaningful. The first families moved in 8 months later. I will never forget Margot, a young mother with twin daughters who had been living in a shelter for 6 months. When she walked through the door of her new home, she collapsed to her knees in the living room and sobbed with a relief so profound it shook the walls. "I have an address," she whispered. "My daughters have an address." That night, I called my mother. "Maman," I said when she answered, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions in my chest. "I wanted you to know that the first families have moved into my housing development." There was a long pause. "That is nice, dear," she said finally, her tone suggesting that she was discussing the weather rather than the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. 24 families, maman. Single mothers and their children who now have beautiful homes instead of sleeping in shelters or on friends' couches. Another pause. Well, I am sure they are grateful. I hung up the phone and realized that I no longer needed her approval or acknowledgement, or even her understanding. I had found something infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that I could create change in the world without permission from anyone. Word of the Marseille project spread through architectural circles like wildfire. Journalists began calling for interviews. Other cities reached out with requests for similar developments. Investors who had once dismissed me as an idealistic dreamer suddenly wanted meetings. Within 2 years, Voss Architecture had offices in 3 cities and a waiting list of projects that stretched into the following decade. I hired Julien Cartier as my first associate, a brilliant young architect who shared my passion for creating beauty without compromise. Together, we developed what became known as the Voss method: sustainable, affordable housing that prioritized dignity and community connection over mere functionality. Our second major project was an eco-village outside of Nice, designed for families transitioning out of homelessness. Solar panels on every roof, rainwater collection systems, and community gardens where residents could grow their own food. We incorporated job training centers and childcare facilities directly into the architectural plan, recognizing that housing was just the foundation of stability, not the entire structure. The night before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I could not sleep. I walked through the completed village under the stars, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone paths we had designed to encourage neighbors to linger and chat rather than hurrying past each other in isolation. Children's laughter drifted from the playground we had positioned at the heart of the community, and I could see lights glowing warmly in windows of homes where families were building new chapters of their lives. This was what inheritance truly meant. Not money passed down from the dead, but life created for the living. The ceremony the next morning drew hundreds of people, including government officials, fellow architects, and journalists from international publications. But the only audience that mattered to me was the families who would call this place home. As I cut the ribbon, cameras flashed and people applauded, but all I could think about was 7-year-old me, sitting at Papa's desk in the vineyard office, drawing pictures of houses while he worked on his ledgers. He had smiled at those childish sketches and told me that maybe someday I would build real houses for real people. He had been right, even if he had never lived to see it. That evening, at the celebration dinner, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Amara, this is Matthias. I saw the news coverage of your project. It is quite impressive. Perhaps we could meet for coffee sometime." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. No desire for reconciliation or revenge. Just the quiet certainty that I had outgrown the need for their validation. So completely that their attention felt irrelevant. I deleted the message without responding and returned to the conversation at my table, where Celeste was telling stories about the first families who would move in the following week. The third year brought the project that would change everything. The European Union announced a competition for the design of refugee housing communities, with a budget that would allow for the construction of entire townships rather than just small developments. The winning design would be implemented in 12 countries, potentially housing tens of thousands of people fleeing war and persecution. I spent 4 months on the proposal, working 20-hour days and sleeping in my office more often than in my own bed. Julien and our growing team pushed the boundaries of everything we thought possible, creating designs that would not just house refugees, but help them rebuild their sense of home and identity in foreign lands. We incorporated cultural spaces where different communities could practice their traditions, language learning centers, and workshop areas where people could use their existing skills to earn income while learning new ones. Every building was designed to be beautiful, to send the message that seeking safety did not mean accepting ugliness or shame. The day of the final presentation in Brussels, I wore the same black dress I had worn to Papa's while reading 3 years earlier. Not because I was mourning, but because I wanted to remember where this journey had begun. I stood before a panel of judges that included architects I had idolized since university, government officials from across Europe, and refugee advocates who had dedicated their lives to this work. My hands did not shake as I unveiled our plans, my voice did not waver as I explained our vision, and my heart felt steady as a drumbeat as I concluded with the words that had become my personal manifesto. Architecture is not just about creating shelter. It is about recognizing the inherent dignity of every human being and translating that recognition into spaces where people can not only survive, but thrive. We won. Not just won, but won unanimously, with judges calling our proposal revolutionary and a new paradigm for humanitarian architecture. The implementation began immediately, with construction starting simultaneously in 12 countries across Europe. I traveled constantly, overseeing projects in Germany and Sweden and Greece, working with local architects and community leaders to adapt our designs for different climates and cultures while maintaining the core principles that made them work. In a refugee camp outside Athens, I met Amara, a Syrian doctor who had fled Aleppo with her 3 children. She walked through the community center we had built and stopped at the medical clinic space, running her hands over the clean walls and modern equipment. "I was a surgeon," she said quietly. "Before the war, I was a surgeon." "You still are," I replied. "This space is waiting for you to fill it." 6 months later, Dr. Amara reopened her practice in our clinic, treating both refugees and local Greek families. She sent me a photo of herself in surgical scrubs, smiling in the operating room we had designed, and wrote, "You did not just build me a house. You built me a life." The success of the refugee housing project catapulted Voss architecture onto the international stage in ways I had never imagined possible. Architecture schools began teaching case studies based on our methods. The United Nations invited me to consult on housing initiatives in developing countries. Magazine covers featured my projects alongside headlines about the architecture of hope and the building revolution. But the moment that truly mattered came 2 years later, at the World Architecture Summit in Geneva. I had been selected to receive the Global Design Award, the highest honor in our profession, for lifetime achievement in humanitarian architecture and sustainable design innovation. The irony was not lost on me that this ceremony was taking place just 3 hours from Lyon, where my family still lived in the shadow of achievements that now seemed impossibly small. The awards ceremony was held in a concert hall filled with the most respected architects in the world. I sat in the front row wearing a midnight blue gown that Celeste had insisted I buy for the occasion, feeling simultaneously like I belonged exactly where I was and like I was inhabiting someone else's life. When they called my name, the standing ovation seemed to last forever. I walked to the podium carrying the crystal trophy that bore my name and the seal of the International Architecture Council. But I was also carrying the weight of every rejection, every closed door, every moment when someone had suggested that my dreams were too big for someone like me. 5 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the massive hall. Someone I loved very much decided that I was not worth including in his legacy. Tonight, I want to thank him, because that rejection forced me to create a legacy of my own. I looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strange, all united by the shared passion for creating spaces where human beings could flourish. Every building we create is a statement about what we believe human beings deserve. When we design with dignity, we declare that every person has worth. When we prioritize beauty alongside functionality, we insist that aesthetics are not luxuries reserved for the wealthy, but basic human rights. When we create communities instead of just structures, we acknowledge that we are not meant to live in isolation, but in connection with one another. The applause was thunderous, but I was not finished. This award does not belong to me alone. It belongs to every family who trusted us with their dreams of home. It belongs to every worker who built these communities with their own hands. It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they do not matter, and chose to matter anyway. As I left the stage, trophy in hand, I felt a presence that made me look up toward the balcony. They were there. My mother, Matthias, and Isadora, sitting in the 3rd row of the upper level, their faces reflecting emotions I could not quite read from that distance. Maman was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even from far away, I could see that her usual perfect composure had cracked. After the ceremony, they waited by the stage door like fans hoping for an autograph from a celebrity. "Amara," Maman said, her voice smaller than I remembered. "We saw the ceremony on the news, but we wanted to be here in person." I looked at the 3 of them, noting how much older they seemed, how uncertainty had replaced the smug confidence I remembered from that devastating day in the lawyer's office. "You came to Geneva," I observed, stating the obvious because I genuinely did not know what else to say. "We wanted to congratulate you," Matthias said, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his voice carrying an unfamiliar humility. "What you have built, Amara, it is extraordinary." Isadora, who had always been the most vocal about my unrealistic career choices, stood silently clutching a program from the ceremony with my photo on the cover. "We made a mistake," Maman said finally, the words seeming to cost her enormous effort. "Your father made a mistake and I supported it. We thought you would be fine because you were so strong, so independent. We did not understand that being strong did not mean you did not deserve to be loved." I felt something shift in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of the possibility of forgiveness at some distant point in the future. "I was fine," I said softly. "Better than fine, actually. You were right that I was strong enough to build my own life. You were wrong to think that strength justified abandonment." We stood in that awkward circle for another minute, the weight of 5 years and thousands of unsaid words hanging between us like smoke. "I should go," I said finally. "There is a reception and people are expecting me." But as I turned to leave, Maman caught my arm gently. "Amara," she said, and for the first time in my adult life, I heard genuine pride in her voice. "When people speak of the Voss name now, they think of what you have built. Schools and villages and homes where families are thriving. That was never in your father's will, but it should have been." I nodded once and walked away, not because I was angry, but because I had somewhere more important to be. The reception was filled with architects and designers and urban planners from around the world, all eager to discuss projects and share ideas and celebrate the evening's achievements. I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and discussing potential collaborations, but part of my mind kept drifting to that encounter with my family. It was not that I needed their approval anymore. I had proven everything that needed proving, to myself and to the world. But there was something healing about hearing acknowledgement from the people who had raised me to believe that I was not enough, even if that acknowledgement came years too late to change the fundamental trajectory of my life. Later that night, back in my hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, I called Celeste to share the news of the evening. "They came," I told her. "My family came to the ceremony." "And how do you feel about that?" she asked, her voice gentle with understanding. "Grateful," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the answer. "Not grateful to them, but grateful for the journey that brought me here. If Papa had left me part of the vineyard, I might have been content with a small life. If they had included me in their legacy, I might never have created my own." "So the rejection was a gift," Celeste mused. "The rejection was a catastrophe that I transformed into a gift," I corrected. "There is a difference." 3 months after the Geneva ceremony, I received a formal letter from the family lawyer. Maman had rewritten her will. She wanted to leave me the vineyard. I read the letter twice, feeling absolutely nothing resembling triumph or satisfaction. The vineyard that had once seemed like the ultimate symbol of family acceptance now felt as relevant to my life as someone else's childhood toys. I wrote back politely declining the inheritance and suggesting that it remain with Matthias, who had spent his entire adult life preparing to manage it. What I did not tell them was that I had just signed contracts for my most ambitious project yet, a partnership with the African Union to design and build sustainable housing communities in 5 countries recovering from natural disasters and armed conflicts. The project would take 7 years and house over 100,000 people. I had work to do. Real work. Important work. Work that would matter long after vineyards and jewelry collections had been forgotten. Today, when I stand in my office overlooking the port of Marseille, surrounded by models of communities we have built and blueprints of communities yet to be born, I sometimes think about that terrible day in the lawyer's office when I learned that my family considered me worthless. I think about the woman I was then, so hungry for belonging that I was willing to accept crumbs of affection from people who did not understand my value. And I think about the woman I am now, who has created homes for thousands of families, who has redefined what humanitarian architecture can accomplish, who has built a legacy that will outlast any vineyard or trust fund or collection of antique jewelry. My name was erased from one will, but it has been written in permanent ink across communities in 12 countries, where children are growing up in beautiful homes their mothers thought they would never deserve. It has been etched into award plaques and university buildings and hospital wings funded by the Voss Foundation for Humanitarian Architecture. It has been spoken with gratitude in languages I do not speak by people whose lives were changed by structures I designed but will never visit. That was never in Papa's will, but it was always in mine. The will to create rather than inherit. The will to build rather than destroy. The will to matter in ways that money cannot measure and family approval cannot define. Tomorrow, I will board a plane to Nairobi to begin our next project. A township for climate refugees that will serve as a model for sustainable community development across sub-Saharan Africa. The design incorporates traditional architectural elements with cutting-edge environmental technology, creating spaces that honor cultural heritage while preparing residents for an uncertain climate future. It will be my masterpiece, and it will house 5,000 people. 5,000 people who matter. 5,000 people who deserve beauty and dignity and hope. 5,000 people whose children will grow up knowing that their worth is not determined by who their parents were, or how much money they inherited, or whether their families considered them valuable enough to remember in legal documents. As I pack my drafting supplies and hard hat and work boots, I realize that I have finally, completely, joyfully outgrown the need for any inheritance except the one I create with my own hands, my own heart, my own unbreakable will to build a world where everyone belongs. And that, more than any vineyard or trust fund or family name, is the legacy I will leave behind. If this story of transformation and triumph inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of people who turned their greatest rejections into their most powerful victories. Your support helps us share stories that matter.